Hi everyone, welcome to another 5 minutes of British literature to go with our reading for this week. Let's talk about Elizabethan drama and theatre culture. England had a tradition of public theatre going back centuries, but it wasn't until the mid-16th century that the first permanent public theatres were established. The first recorded permanent theatre was the Red Lion, established in 1567, and over the next few decades, around half a dozen more theatres popped up around London. They tended to have similar layouts. For the audience, a large open area in the middle, surrounded by a 3-story ring of box seats. For the performers, a 4-stage that jutted into the audience where most of the action and speaking would take place, and a rear stage where musicians could set up or where actors could enter and exit the stage. Having a permanent space with a predictable layout contributed a lot of changes to the English drama that we see at the end of the 1590s. Playwrights could write for that space, and if they were attached to an acting company, they could write for a specific set of players. The staging options offered by the theater space opened the door for dramatic experiments that we don't necessarily see in the plays of the Middle Ages. Renaissance drama is littered with things like balcony scenes and ghosts, in part because the theater buildings had features like trapdoors and balconies that authors could incorporate into their works. Background sets and costumes were still rare and rudimentary since both were expensive, but they started to become more common with theater buildings offered a space to store them. The lives of actors continued to be hardscrabble. It was not reliable work and it did not pay well. However, permanent theaters meant that acting companies no longer had to travel, which led to more stable lives for them and a better chance at lobbying for a noble's patronage. Most of a company's income came from performance revenue, but having a noble sponsor meant that legally the actors were the nobleman's servants, a status that protected them from being arrested as vagrants. By the beginning of the 17th century, acting companies organized themselves in a way that resembled trade guilds. New hires were put through an apprenticeship under the supervision and guidance of veteran actors, and they could work their way up to more difficult and more prominent roles. An actor's workload was staggering, since they had to have dozens of parts memorized and ready to perform at a moment's notice. Unlike today's theater, Elizabethan acting companies did not perform the same play 2 days in a row, and they performed most works just 2 or 3 times in a season. Since the theater space was full of distractions and there was no way to dim the lights, actors had to put a ton of energy into keeping the audience's attention. And if their audience didn't like the scheduled play, they would change works even in mid-performance. Life as a playwright was possibly even more precarious. Generally, a playwright contracted with an acting troupe to produce a set number of plays, collected the price of a play in increments during the writing period, and then received the revenue for the 3rd night that the play was performed, if the play survived that long. A typical playwright would produce 1 or 2 plays a year, 3 if he was a fast worker. So many playwrights of this period collaborated with fellow authors to increase their productivity. It was not unusual for a play to have multiple authors, and even when they didn't collaborate as equals, playwrights frequently revised and edited each other's work after a company had purchased it. After the sale, the play was the property of the company, and the playwright no longer had any rights to his work. Playwriting was not glamorous work, and playwrights were not glamorous people. They were usually men of middle-class backgrounds who possessed a little education and a lot of moxie. Christopher Marlowe graduated from Cambridge and then went off the grid for a few years, possibly as a spy for the crown. He died in a bar fight in 1593 at the height of his career. William Shakespeare left his family to chase a career in the London theatre, and he was one of the few playwrights who acted to supplement his income. Despite being incredibly prolific as a writer, he achieved his real financial success when he became a shareholder in his acting company and their theater. Despite its popularity, London's theater industry was not well received by everyone. Some clergymen complained that the theater interfered with people's church attendance, and eventually they persuaded the Privy Council to ban performances on Sundays so that the church would not have to compete with the theater for audiences. Some critics argued that the theater promoted vice and dissolution, especially in the youth. The theater supposedly lured them away from work and learning and prayer and sucked them into a world of artifice and fantasy and idleness. Other critics accused the theaters of being a public nuisance. And this criticism was not wrong. On good days, theater crowds generated a lot of noise and traffic and trash. On bad days, they also spread disease and attracted criminals. The theater had enough of a bad reputation that theater owners had to locate their playhouses outside of city limits, where it was easier for them to acquire land and to escape the notice of the local authorities. Nonetheless, theater was wildly popular among the English public in the 16th and 17th centuries. By the end of the 16th century, commercial public theater was a large, organized, profitable segment of England's public entertainment industry. It provided a valuable space for public expression and artistic experimentation, and this period of theater produced some of England's greatest authors and literary works. Unfortunately, it came to a screeching halt in 1642 when the Puritans took control of Parliament and ordered the theaters shut down. London's theaters would not reopen until 1660, almost 20 years later. Thank you for watching, and please review the video on 16th century humanism for this week as well.